I spent 6 years eating generic brand oatmeal and working double shifts as a freelance data analyst to afford this silence. When you buy 2 acres of land on the edge of a quiet county, you aren't just buying dirt and grass. You are buying the right to breathe without someone else's lungs. My house isn't a mansion. It is a modest, reclaimed farmhouse with a porch that catches the morning sun, and a garden where I spent my weekends reviving heirloom rose bushes my grandmother gave me before she passed. I am the kind of person who keeps my lawn edged, my taxes paid, and my voice low. I thought that being a good neighbor meant staying out of the way. I was wrong. The Millers lived in the oversized, beige colonial next door. Greg and Brenda Miller didn't value silence. They valued space, specifically space they didn't pay for. The first time I met them, I was unboxing a set of garden shears on my front lawn. I expected a welcome basket, or at least a polite wave. Instead, Greg Miller walked across the invisible line dividing our properties with a beer in his hand, and a look of practiced authority on his face. He didn't introduce himself. He just pointed a thick finger toward the line of oak trees that I knew, based on my deed, sat 10 feet inside my boundary. He told me that the previous owner had been a real stickler, but that the neighborhood generally understood that the natural line was much closer to my porch. He called it a community understanding. I remember smiling, the kind of polite, confused smile you give to a person who clearly has the wrong address. I told him I'd checked the pins during the closing, and that the stakes were pretty clear. Greg didn't smile back. He just took a long sip of his beer, and told me that stakes can be moved by the frost or by mistake, but 20 years of history doesn't lie. He spoke about his family's usage of that land like it was a sacred right. Brenda joined him a moment later, nodding along. She didn't look at me. She looked at my heirloom roses. She mentioned that they'd always thought about putting a privacy fence there to keep their kids safe, and that since I was new, I probably wouldn't mind if they straightened things out. I went inside that night feeling a strange chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. I am a person of logic. I believe in spreadsheets, legal descriptions, and the physical reality of iron pins driven into the earth. I assumed they were just old-fashioned people who had grown comfortable with a vacant lot next door. I decided to be the bigger person, and simply maintain my property with quiet diligence. I spent the next week mulching the rose bushes and clearing the brush near those oak trees, making it clear that the land was occupied and loved. I thought that by showing I was a responsible owner, they would respect the boundary. I didn't realize that to people like the Millers, my care was seen as a challenge to their dominance. They didn't want a neighbor, they wanted a subordinate. I went to bed on a Tuesday night thinking about the bird feeder I wanted to hang from the strongest oak branch. I fell asleep to the peaceful sound of the wind in the leaves. I woke up at 6:30 on Wednesday morning to a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, mechanical thud of a gas-powered post-hole digger. I threw on a robe and ran to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was Greg Miller, flanked by 2 hired laborers, standing well past the oak trees. They were barely 15 feet from my side door. They weren't just guessing anymore. They were digging deep into the soil I had spent years saving for. I thought they were just confused about the markers. Then I saw the spray paint on my grandmother's heirloom rose bushes. I stepped off my porch with my hands open and empty, trying to keep my breathing steady despite the roar of the auger. The smell of fresh gasoline and churned earth filled the air. I walked right up to the line of orange spray paint that Greg had used to decapitate the blooming history of my family. He didn't stop the machine immediately. He let it drill a few more inches into my soil before he finally kicked the engine off, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. I asked him, as calmly as I could, what he thought he was doing. Greg wiped sweat from his forehead with a hand covered in my dirt, and looked at me like I was a child interrupting an adult conversation. He told me they were finally getting around to that privacy fence we talked about. I reminded him that we hadn't talked about a fence. We had talked about him wanting my land, and that he was currently 6 feet over the property line. That's when the gaslighting started. Brenda appeared from behind their garage, holding a clipboard like she was a site foreman. She told me I was being hysterical, and that they had lived in that house for 20 years. She said they knew every inch of this neighborhood long before I showed up with my moving truck and my fancy ideas. When I mentioned the iron survey pins, Greg just laughed. He told me those pins were probably shifted when the county redid the drainage ditch 5 years ago, and that I was being unnecessarily territorial for a newcomer. He said a good neighbor would be happy that someone was finally putting up a high-quality cedar fence that would raise the property value for everyone. I told them to stop immediately, that I hadn't authorized any construction on my deeded acreage. Brenda sighed, that long, theatrical sigh of a woman who thinks she is dealing with a difficult subordinate. She told me I wasn't being a team player, and that the community spirit of their cul-de-sac relied on people not being so litigious over a few feet of grass. She actually told me that I should be grateful they were doing the manual labor. While she was talking, I looked past them. In their driveway sat a flatbed trailer stacked high with premium pressure-treated lumber and rolls of chain link. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pre-planned invasion. They had already spent thousands of dollars on materials based on the assumption that I would be too timid to stop them. I realized then that my politeness was being interpreted as a green light for their greed. They didn't see a property owner. They saw a soft target they could intimidate into shrinking. I told Greg one last time that the fence was on my land, and that I wouldn't allow it to be finished. He just turned the auger back on, the engine drowning out my voice, and signaled his workers to keep digging the next hole. He didn't even look at me. He just treated me like a ghost haunting my own backyard. I realized I couldn't win a shouting match with a machine, so I turned around to head back to the house to find my phone. As I walked away, Mr. Miller shouted, "Don't worry, we'll send you the bill for your half." That was the moment my kindness died. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and a stack of manila folders that represented every cent of my life's work. My hands were still shaking from the confrontation outside, but as I started opening the documents, the adrenaline began to cool into something much sharper and more dangerous. I am a data analyst by trade. I don't deal in community spirit or neighborhood understandings. I deal in hard, cold numbers that live on paper and hold up in a court of law. I started with the purchase price. I had paid $450,000 for this property. That wasn't a gift, and it wasn't a suggestion. It was a binding financial commitment. I pulled up my tax records and looked at the $8,000 I sent to the county every single year. When you pay that kind of money, you aren't paying for a vibe. You are paying for every square inch defined within the legal description of the plot. I pulled out my calculator and opened a fresh spreadsheet. I titled it the Miller Audit. I began with the physical dimensions. My property is a rectangular 2-acre lot. Based on the markers Greg was currently ignoring, he was attempting to shift the boundary line by precisely 8 feet along the entire length of our shared border, which ran for 350 feet. I did the math. That was 2,800 square feet of land. In a suburban rural transition zone like ours, land value is calculated with surgical precision. Based on my purchase price, I was paying approximately $5.16 per square foot of dirt. Greg wasn't just straightening a line. He was attempting to perform a daylight robbery of $14,448 worth of my equity. I stared at that number on my screen. It was more than I had spent on my entire kitchen renovation. It was more than the cost of the car I drove. I added a line item for the taxes. Since I was the one paying the $8,000 a year, and he was trying to steal roughly 3% of my total acreage, I calculated that I had already paid several $100s in property taxes for the privilege of him standing on my dirt and insulting my character. The audacity of his "send you the bill" comment started to make sense in a sickening way. He wasn't just entitled. He was a predator who thought he could outsource his home improvement costs to the person he was robbing. I felt a surge of cold clarity. I began scanning the digital plat maps from the county recorder's office, looking for any possible reason he could be so confident. I looked at the meets and bounds, the historical transfers, and the original subdivision filings from the late 70s. I wanted to see if there was any ambiguity, any ghost line that he could be clinging to in his delusional mind. I spent 3 hours cross-referencing my deed with the neighboring parcels. I looked at the topographic surveys and the utility line placements. I was looking for a mistake, a reason to give him the benefit of the doubt one last time. I didn't find a mistake. I found a motive. Deep in the digital archives, I found a scanned PDF of a dusty folder from the 1980s that had been flagged during a previous title search. It was a handwritten agreement tucked behind an old survey map. As I read the fine print and looked at the faded ink of the signatures, my stomach dropped. The Millers weren't just guessing about where the line was. They were hiding a 40-year-old secret about a shared easement that changed everything they had told me. I didn't go back outside to argue. You cannot reason with a person who views your boundaries as a mere suggestion. Instead, I drove to the nearest electronics store and spent $1,200 on a high-definition 4K surveillance system with night vision and motion tracking. If the Millers wanted to put on a show, I was going to make sure it was recorded in the highest resolution possible. I spent the afternoon mounting the cameras on the corners of my eaves, positioning them so they had a crystal-clear view of the disputed line and the devastation they had already caused to my roses. While the cameras were syncing to the cloud, I sat at my desk and drafted a formal cease and desist notice. I didn't use flowery language. I used the specific legal citations from my deed and the local building codes they were currently violating by failing to pull a permit for a permanent structure. I printed it out, placed it in a bright red folder, and walked back out to the edge of the property. Greg was there, leaning against a pile of cedar planks, looking triumphant. I didn't say a word. I simply handed him the folder. He didn't even open it. He looked at the red cover, looked back at me, and let out a bark of a laugh that made my skin crawl. He called Brenda over, and right there in front of the hired crew, he made a show of crumpling the paper into a ball and dropping it into the fresh, wet mud of a post hole. Brenda pulled out her own phone and started filming me, mocking my tough girl act and telling her Facebook followers that the new neighbor was trying to sue them for building a fence. They were laughing, high-fiving the workers, and acting as if they had already won a great victory. They thought they were untouchable because they had lived there longer. They thought the law was a matter of popularity rather than precision. While Brenda was busy narrating her livestream about how unhinged Greg signaled the crew to start the next phase. I watched from my porch as a small cement mixer began to churn. They didn't hesitate. They started pouring wet concrete directly into the holes they had dug on my land, anchoring the heavy cedar posts into the earth I paid taxes on. Each wet splash of concrete felt like a permanent scar being etched into my sanctuary. They were literally cementing their theft, turning a verbal dispute into a structural reality. Greg looked up at my camera and waved his beer bottle, a smirk plastered across his face. He thought he was winning because he was moving faster than he thought I could react. He viewed the legal notice as a bluff, a desperate attempt by a weak woman to reclaim what he had already decided was his. He thought that once the concrete dried, the land was officially his by right of possession. He was operating on the old playground rule of finders keepers, but he forgot that we weren't on a playground. We were on a surveyed plot of private property. I went back inside and watched the live feed on my monitor. I saw them leveling the posts, checking their work with a pride that was entirely unearned. I watched the sun begin to set over the half-finished skeleton of a fence that didn't belong there. My heart was no longer racing. It had gone cold and steady. I pulled out my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to my attorney to authorize the filing of a formal injunction. The second was to a contact I had found through a specialized contractors board. The Millers thought the paper was just a bluff. They didn't realize I wasn't just calling a lawyer. I was calling a specialist. The digital assault began at exactly 7:45 that evening. I was sitting in my darkened living room, the blue light of my laptop screen reflecting off the glass of water I hadn't touched in hours. I didn't have to go looking for the trouble. It found its way into my notifications with the persistence of a fever. Brenda Miller had posted to the Oak Ridge Community Voices Facebook group, a digital town square with over 3,000 local members. She hadn't just posted a complaint. She had crafted a work of absolute fiction designed to annihilate my reputation before I could even learn the names of my other neighbors. The post featured a blurry, low-angle photo of me standing on my porch, cropped to make me look like I was screaming. The caption was a masterpiece of suburban manipulation. She claimed that I had approached her husband and their hired workers while wielding a heavy garden tool, shouting profanities and threatening to level the neighborhood. She painted a picture of a hostile, unhinged newcomer who had moved in and immediately started a war over a few inches of grass. But the part that made my blood run cold was when she brought their children into it. She wrote that her kids were now too terrified to play in their own backyard because the woman next door was watching them through cameras and shouting threats over the property line. It was a calculated, vicious lie. She knew exactly which buttons to press in a family-oriented community. Within 20 minutes, the comments section was a shark tank. People I had never met, people who lived 3 streets over and had never seen my face, were calling for my head. One woman wrote that people like me were the reason neighborhoods were going to hell. Another man suggested that the community should organize a boycott of whatever business I worked for. I watched in real time as the narrative of the saintly Millers versus the monster in 4B became the official truth of Oak Ridge. My phone started buzzing with private messages from strangers. Some were polite suggestions that I should just move out if I couldn't get along with people. Others were much darker, filled with the kind of vitriol that people only feel comfortable spewing when they think they are defending a helpless family against a predator. I saw one of my other neighbors, a man I'd waved to just 2 days ago, comment that he had always felt a bad energy from my house. The speed of the social execution was breathtaking. Brenda was in the comments, playing the role of the trembling victim, thanking everyone for their prayers and support, and lamenting how hard it was to be a good Christian neighbor in these trying times. Greg joined in too, posting photos of the half-finished fence and claiming he was just trying to secure his family's safety against a documented threat. They were building a moral wall to match their physical one. They wanted to make me a pariah so that when I finally did take legal action, the community would see it as further proof of my instability. They were trying to win the court of public opinion before we ever stepped into a real one. I felt a momentary surge of panic, the kind that makes you want to log on and scream the truth into the void. I wanted to post the video of Greg laughing while he crumpled my legal notice. I wanted to show the world the spray-painted ruins of my grandmother's roses. But I stopped myself. I realized that the Millers were playing a game of emotions, and you cannot win that game with facts when the audience has already decided you're the villain. If they wanted me to be the monster, I would be the most precise, methodical monster they had ever encountered. I stopped scrolling. I closed the Facebook tab and silenced my phone. The digital world could howl all it wanted. It didn't change the coordinates on a survey map or the laws of the state. While they were busy collecting likes and angry face emojis, I was focusing on the physical reality of the situation. I went back to the website of the specialized equipment company I had contacted earlier. I filled out the insurance waivers, provided my credit card information for the massive deposit, and confirmed the delivery coordinates. I made sure the drop-off point was tucked well behind my house, out of sight from the Millers' front windows. My inbox was flooded with hate, but while they were typing comments, I was signing a rental agreement for a Cat D9 Bulldozer. The house was silent, but my mind was a cacophony of soaring costs and calculated losses. I pulled up my master spreadsheet, the one I had titled The Miller Reckoning, and I began to populate the cells with the cold, hard reality of their entitlement. I have always found a strange comfort in the binary nature of debt. You either owe it or you don't. There is no room for Brenda's Facebook theatrics or Greg's beer-fueled bravado within the confines of a cell on a balance sheet. I started with the most immediate out-of-pocket expense, the emergency professional survey. Because the Millers had ignored the original pins, I had to hire a high-end firm to come out on short notice to perform a certified, ironclad boundary stakeout with a legal seal. That was $2,500. I typed the number into the column, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Next came the legal weight. I had already sent a $5,000 retainer to a property rights attorney who specialized in aggressive litigation. This wasn't a general practitioner. This was a man who enjoyed dismantling illegal encroachments. That $5,000 was gone the moment I hit send on the wire transfer, and I added it to the running total. Then, I turned my attention to the physical destruction of my sanctuary. I looked at the receipts from the specialty nursery where my grandmother had originally purchased those heirloom roses decades ago. To replace established, mature bushes of that specific variety isn't just a matter of buying a few seeds at a hardware store. It requires professional transplanting of mature stock. I estimated the replacement cost, including soil remediation for the areas Greg had contaminated with concrete runoff, at $3,200. I felt a sharp pang of grief as I typed that in, but I suppressed it. Emotions are expensive. I needed to stay focused on the recovery. I moved on to the more technical aspects of the audit. The value of stolen usage. Under state law, if someone occupies your land without permission, you are entitled to the fair market rental value of that land for the duration of the encroachment. I researched the local commercial lease rates for undeveloped land and applied a daily rate to the 2,800 square feet they were currently holding hostage behind their half-built wall of cedar and spite. It wasn't just the dirt. It was the loss of my quiet enjoyment and the security of my perimeter. I added an item for the security system I had been forced to install, $1,200 for the 4K cameras, and the cloud storage subscription. I wouldn't have needed to turn my home into a fortress if they hadn't turned my yard into a battlefield. I then factored in the administrative costs. The hours I had spent away from my freelance clients to manage this crisis, the filing fees for the injunction, and the cost of the certified mail they had so gleefully crumpled into the mud. I was meticulous. I didn't pad the numbers. I didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough on its own. I looked at the bottom of the screen where the sum formula sat waiting. I hit enter. The total came to $18,400. I stared at that figure for a long time. To the Millers, this was a neighborhood squabble, a minor disagreement between a longtime resident and a pushy newcomer. To me, it was a felony-level theft of my financial future. They were treating my equity like a buffet, helping themselves to whatever they wanted because they assumed I was too weak to send them the bill. People like Greg and Brenda think that if they yell loud enough, the numbers will change. They think that if they get enough people to like their lies on social media, the debt will simply evaporate. They don't understand that a lien doesn't care about your popularity. A judge doesn't care how many years you've lived on a cul-de-sac. I printed the spreadsheet. I wanted to have a physical copy in my hand, something I could look at to remind myself why I was doing what I was about to do. I wasn't being mean. I wasn't being a hostile newcomer. I was an accountant of my own life, and the books were wildly out of balance. I looked out the window at the dark silhouette of the fence. The concrete was dry now. The posts were set. Greg had spent his own money to build a monument to his own arrogance, thinking that by the time I got a court date, the fact on the ground would be too difficult to move. He was betting on the idea that I would see the finished fence and just give up because the destruction of it would be too messy. He didn't realize that I am a person who finds a deep, visceral satisfaction in cleaning up a mess, especially when the mess is a direct result of someone else's greed. I thought about the $18,400 and how it was only the beginning. The Millers had been so focused on stealing my land that they hadn't bothered to look at the structural integrity of what they were building, or where their own drainage was being diverted. The total came to $18,400. And that was before I accounted for the structural damage they were about to cause themselves. The sun had barely cleared the tree line when the white truck with the official county license decals pulled into my gravel driveway. This was the moment where the subjective reality of the Millers was going to collide with the objective reality of the law. I had requested a civil standby from the local sheriff's office, and a few minutes later, a cruiser pulled up behind the surveyor. I didn't want to fight. I wanted witnesses. I wanted third-party validation that would make the Facebook comments and the backyard shouting matches irrelevant. The surveyor, a man named Miller, ironically enough, didn't care about neighborhood politics. He carried a robotic total station and a prism pole with the bored detachment of a man who spent his life dealing with people who thought their feelings were more accurate than GPS satellites. As he began to set up his equipment, Greg Miller came charging out of his house, his face already a deep shade of purple. He was screaming before his feet even hit my grass. He was demanding to know why the police were on his property, and telling the surveyor to pack up his gear or face a lawsuit. The deputy, a veteran officer named Miller, apparently it was a popular name in this county, stepped forward with his hands tucked into his belt. He didn't raise his voice. He just told Greg to stay on his side of the marked line, and let the man do his job. Greg started in with the usual script, talking about his 20 years of residency and how the pins had been moved, but the surveyor didn't even look up. He was busy cross-referencing the original subdivision plat from 1978 with the electronic markers he was finding in the dirt. I stood on my porch, silent and watchful. I wasn't the unhinged woman from the Facebook posts today. I was a property owner standing on the land she paid for. The surveyor moved methodically along the edge of the property. Every time he stopped, he pounded a bright orange stake into the ground and tied a length of neon flagging to it. With every stake, the true line moved further and further away from my house and deeper into the area Greg had claimed was his. When he reached the spot where the Millers had started their fence, the surveyor paused. He looked at the cedar posts, then at his redoubt, and then he drove a stake exactly 30 inches behind the fence Greg had just finished building. The property pirates hadn't just built a fence on my land. They had built it so far into my property that they had effectively cut off my access to my own drainage easement. The validation was absolute. The surveyor moved toward the Millers' driveway, marking a line that proved their decorative stone wall was also encroaching by nearly a foot. Brenda had come out by now, her phone held high as she tried to film the deputy, her voice shrill as she accused him of being in my pocket. She was screaming about her rights, her children's safety, and the corruption of the local government. The deputy remained stoic, a human wall of indifference to her theatrics. He had seen this 100 times before. The moment when a bully realizes that their loud voice doesn't have the power to change a legal boundary. The Millers were standing in what they thought was their pristine sanctuary, but the orange stakes were telling a different story. They were standing on my land, shouting at a man paid by the county to tell the truth. Brenda was vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy, realizing that her Facebook narrative was crumbling in the face of a badge and a tripod. She looked at the stakes, then at the deputy, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and genuine shock that the world wasn't bending to her will. Mrs. Miller pointed at the cop and yelled, "You can't do this. This is our home. You can't just let her take it." The cop just checked his watch and said, "He can do whatever he wants with his land, ma'am." The low rumble of the flatbed truck vibrated through my floorboards before I ever saw it. I stepped out onto my porch as the driver unchained the Cat D9. It was a massive, yellow beast of a machine, a blunt instrument of industrial-grade correction that looked entirely out of place in our quiet, manicured cul-de-sac. The Millers had spent the morning nail-gunning the final cedar slats into place, working with a frantic speed as if finishing the fence would somehow solidify their claim. They stopped when the bulldozer's tracks hit the asphalt with a metallic clatter. I didn't wait for them to start their routine. I walked down the driveway, met the driver, and took the controls myself. I grew up on a farm in the Midwest. Greg Miller made the mistake of assuming a woman who works on a laptop doesn't know how to operate a hydraulic blade. I climbed into the cab, the smell of diesel and old grease filling my senses, and engaged the engine. The roar was deafening, a physical wall of sound that silenced the neighborhood birds and brought neighbors out onto their lawns. I steered the machine toward the orange survey stakes. Greg and Brenda were paralyzed for a split second before they realized I wasn't just parking it. As I dropped the heavy steel blade and began to crawl forward, Greg broke into a sprint. He threw himself in front of the machine, his arms spread wide, screaming that I was a murderer and a lunatic. Brenda was right behind him, shrieking for someone to call the police. I didn't stop. I kept the machine moving at a literal snail's crawl, giving the deputy, who was still on site for the civil standby, plenty of time to act. The deputy didn't hesitate. He grabbed Greg by the shoulder and hauled him back toward his own driveway, shouting that he was obstructing a lawful removal of a nuisance. Brenda tried to claw her way past the officer, but he blocked her path with a firm, unyielding arm. I watched them through the reinforced glass of the cab. Their faces were distorted with a kind of primal fury I had never seen before. They truly believed that because they had spent money on that wood, I had no right to touch it. They believed their investment superseded my deed. I shifted the lever, and the massive blade made contact with the first cedar post, the one Greg had anchored in 3 feet of wet concrete on my land. The machine didn't even strain. The hydraulics hissed, the steel bit into the wood, and the sound of the structural failure was like a gunshot. The post didn't just tip. It shattered, the concrete base being ripped out of the earth like a bad tooth. I kept the blade low, pushing the entire section of the privacy fence into a heap of splintered timber and twisted wire. I was careful to stay exactly 2 inches on my side of the orange flagging. I wasn't destroying their property. I was removing an illegal obstruction from mine. The Millers were watching $20,000 of material and labor turn into a pile of expensive kindling in a matter of seconds. As the first fence post snapped like a toothpick, Mr. Miller turned pale. He realized I wasn't just moving the fence. I was taking the land back to the inch. The legal system is often described as a slow grind, but when you have a mountain of evidence and a certified survey, it feels more like a guillotine. After the bulldozer cleared the physical mess, the real work began in the quiet halls of the county courthouse. I didn't just want the fence gone. I wanted the Miller audit to be settled in full. My attorney filed a comprehensive lawsuit for the $18,400 in damages, plus legal fees and the cost of the heavy equipment rental. The Millers tried to fight it at first, hiring a cut-rate lawyer who tried to argue adverse possession and neighborly acquiescence. But you cannot argue adverse possession when the owner has only been on the deed for 6 months and has a paper trail of cease and desist notices. The judge took one look at the 4K footage of Greg laughing while he crumpled a legal warning, and the surveyor's report showing a deliberate 3-foot encroachment, and the hammer came down. The judgment was absolute. The Millers were ordered to pay the full amount within 30 days. I knew they didn't have it. I had done my homework on their finances too. Greg liked to buy toys, boats, trucks and high-end outdoor kitchens, all on credit. They were living the high-end suburban life on a house of cards budget. When the 30 days passed and my bank account remained unchanged, my lawyer filed the paperwork for a judgment lien. This was the moment the power dynamic permanently inverted. A lien is a beautiful, silent thing. It sits on the title of a property like a parasite, growing every day with statutory interest. By filing that lien, I effectively became a silent partner in the Millers' home. They couldn't refinance, they couldn't take out a second mortgage, and they certainly couldn't sell the house without paying me every single cent plus the mounting interest. The monsters were now effectively paying me rent for the privilege of living next door to the woman they had tried to ruin. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted almost overnight. The Facebook group, which had once been a cauldron of hate directed at me, went strangely silent when I posted a scanned copy of the court's final judgment and the certified survey. People don't like to be on the losing side of a factual argument. The same neighbors who had suggested I move out were suddenly waving to me again, their eyes darting to the empty, scarred earth where the fence used to be. The Millers, however, couldn't handle the reality of their new situation. They had built their entire identity on being the kings of the cul-de-sac, and now everyone knew they were legally documented thieves who were underwater on their mortgage. The pressure of the lien, combined with their already overextended credit, became a slow-motion car crash. Greg's bravado vanished. He stopped drinking beer on the porch and started spending his evenings staring at the orange stakes that still sat in the ground, marking the boundary of his failure. Brenda stopped posting her Christian neighbor updates and started keeping the blinds closed at all hours of the day. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, fueled by an interest rate that was eating their remaining equity alive. They tried to negotiate, sending me a pathetic email asking if I would settle for half, so they could keep their home. I didn't even reply. I simply forwarded it to my attorney with a note that said, "Not a penny less than the total." I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. You don't get a discount on the truth. Finally, the inevitable happened. The for sale sign appeared on their lawn, a desperate attempt to liquidate before the bank moved in. But because of my lien, they were in a position of extreme weakness. They needed a fast, cash-only buyer who wouldn't be scared off by a clouded title and a pending legal settlement. They needed someone who didn't care about the neighborhood drama. They lost their status in the neighborhood when the for sale sign went up. But the best part? The buyer was my best friend. The gravel in my driveway finally settled into a permanent, peaceful stillness the day the Millers' moving truck disappeared around the bend. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool morning air, and looked out over my 2 acres. The scarred earth where the fence had once stood was already beginning to heal. My best friend, Sarah, had bought the house next door at a significant discount, and our first act of neighborly cooperation was to plant a new row of heirloom roses exactly 12 inches on my side of the line. There is a profound, quiet power in knowing exactly where you stand. The neighborhood is different now. The Oak Ridge community voices, Group has moved on to complaining about trash pickup and stray cats. The vitriol of the previous months buried under the weight of the court's public records. People treat me with a new kind of practiced respect. They realize that I am not a person who seeks out conflict, but I am certainly a person who finishes it. I don't believe in the old saying that good fences make good neighbors. A fence is just wood and wire. It can be built by anyone with a hammer and a lack of conscience. I believe that clarity makes good neighbors. I believe that respected boundaries make a community. And above all, I believe that while good fences make good neighbors, good lawyers make much better ones. I watched a cardinal land on one of the orange survey stakes I'd decided to leave in the ground for a while longer. It was a reminder that sanctuary isn't something you're given, it's something you defend. The Millers didn't just lose a strip of grass. They lost the ability to intimidate a stranger. They moved to a cramped condo 3 towns over. A place governed by a strict set of rules, and a very active homeowners association. I hope they enjoy having someone tell them exactly where their balcony ends. If you want to hear how I dealt with the HOA president who tried to fine me for my revenge garden, click here.